Canada has places it technically owns but conveniently forgets until someone asks awkward questions in Parliament. They show up on maps and weather reports, yet almost no one knows them because they're costly, inconvenient, and proof the country claimed more land than it can manage. Welcome to Canada's forgotten edges, where jurisdiction exists in theory, but enforcement needs a float plane, weeks of planning, and a bureaucrat willing to admit the place exists. Real, remote, and barely administered. Ready? Subscribe if you want to know where in Canada you can still build without asking permission from 17 different government departments. Number 10. The unorganized territories of Northern Ontario. There's a massive chunk of Northern Ontario where municipal government doesn't exist. Not because it collapsed, but because it was never created in the first place. Welcome to Ontario's unorganized territories, approximately 400,000 square kilometers of land, which is larger than Germany, where you're technically in Ontario but practically in a legal vacuum that makes Wild West towns look overregulated. These aren't parks or protected areas. These are actual inhabited regions with camps, cabins, mines, and people living year-round in places where the nearest municipal office is 300 kilometers away and has no jurisdiction over you anyway, because you're outside municipal boundaries in what the province awkwardly calls unincorporated areas, which is government code for we own it but don't really run it. According to Ontario's Municipal Act, these areas fall under provincial jurisdiction administered by the Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources, and Forestry, which sounds impressive until you realize that means basically nobody is checking what you're doing unless you're mining without permits or causing problems visible from satellites. Population data is sketchy because the census struggles to count people living in places without civic addresses. Estimates suggest 10 to 15,000 people live permanently in these unorganized territories, with thousands more using camps and cabins seasonally. But nobody really knows because there's no municipal government tracking residents, no property tax rolls in the traditional sense, and no bylaw enforcement officers measuring your grass height or telling you what color to paint your shed. The building code situation is beautifully vague. Ontario's Building Code Act technically applies province-wide, but enforcement in unorganized territories is practically non-existent. The province issues permits for larger structures if you request them, but for small cabins, outbuildings, and off-grid dwellings under a certain square footage, the enforcement is, we'll get to it if someone complains, which they won't because your nearest neighbor is a moose. Property in these areas sells for absurdly low prices. Raw land goes for $500 to $3,000 per acre on sites like Kijiji and Purple Bricks, with people listing 40-acre parcels for $20,000 to $50,000 total, which is what Toronto residents pay monthly for parking spots. These aren't scam listings. These are real titled properties in areas so remote that nobody wants them except people seeking exactly that kind of remoteness. One person on Reddit described living in unorganized Ontario as, like being in Canada, but Canada forgot to send the rules. There are no garbage collection services, no municipal water, no zoning bylaws about setbacks or lot coverage. You want to build a yurt? Go ahead. Want to live in a shipping container? Nobody's stopping you. Want to have chickens, goats, and an off-grid solar setup? The province doesn't care as long as you're not dumping industrial waste into waterways or operating unlicensed nuclear reactors. Healthcare is challenging with nursing stations in some areas, but hospitals hours away by logging road. Education means either homeschooling or long commutes to towns with schools. Internet is Starlink or nothing, which actually works surprisingly well now that Elon Musk decided Northern Canada deserves connectivity. The unorganized territories aren't for everyone, but they represent something rare in modern Canada. Land where you can build and live without asking 17 bureaucrats for permission and paying thousands in fees for the privilege of existing on property you supposedly own. Now the following one, I am sure you didn't even know it existed. Number 9. Chikichtaluk Region's Remote Islands. There are islands in Nunavut so remote that Canada claims them for sovereignty purposes, but has never actually administered them in any meaningful way beyond occasionally sending military patrols to plant flags and take photos proving we were there. These islands in the Chikichtaluk region, formerly Baffin region, exist in the high Arctic where temperatures make northern Ontario look tropical, and the growing season is measured in days, not months. Islands like Axel Heiberg, Elif Ringness, and parts of Devon Island have zero permanent population, but technically fall under Canadian jurisdiction through Nunavut's territorial government. Except Nunavut's government, based in Iqaluit, has no practical way to administer islands that are 1,000 kilometers north and accessible only by chartered plane or icebreaker during the brief summer shipping season. Population, 0 permanent, maybe 5 to 10 researchers during summer field seasons. Cost of living, immeasurable because there's no economy, no stores, and supplies cost whatever it costs to charter a twin otter to fly them in. Crime rate 0, unless you count polar bears breaking into research stations, which happens and is technically property damage, but good luck filing that police report. These islands exist in legal limbo. They're Nunavut territory, which means Nunavut's laws apply in theory. But enforcement requires someone actually being there to enforce laws. And the territorial government has bigger concerns like maintaining services in communities where people actually live year-round. Could you move there? Technically, nothing stops you beyond logistics, money, and survival capability. You'd need to either buy land through Nunavut's complicated land ownership system involving Inuit land claims, or more realistically, just show up and build something and hope nobody notices because they won't. The territorial government isn't monitoring remote islands for unauthorized habitation because they're busy trying to provide healthcare and education to communities where people have lived for thousands of years. Building codes exist on paper through Nunavut's adoption of the National Building Code, but enforcement on remote islands is theoretical. You'd need to survive without services, grow or import all food, handle medical emergencies yourself, and maintain mental health during months of darkness and isolation, so complete it makes solitary confinement look social. But here's the thing, you'd be genuinely free. No property taxes because there's no municipal government to collect them. No bylaws because there's no municipality. No neighbors complaining about your chickens or your RV or your shed that doesn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. Just you, the Arctic, and the occasional polar bear reminding you that you're a guest in their territory, looking for a better place where you can go and not freeze. Number 8. The Interlake region of Manitoba. There's a region in Manitoba between Lake Winnipeg and Lake Manitoba where municipal boundaries get weird, enforcement gets selective, and people have been living how they want for generations because government presence is more theoretical than actual. The Interlake isn't ungoverned exactly, but it's governed in that special rural Manitoba way where rules exist, but enforcement requires someone caring enough to drive hours on gravel roads to tell you to stop, and frankly, they have better things to do. This region includes municipalities like Fisher, Grahamdale, and areas around Lake Manitoba, where population density is so low that bylaw enforcement is one part-time officer covering hundreds of square kilometers. According to Manitoba's municipal data, some of these areas have populations under 500, spread across territories the size of small European countries. People in the Interlake have been building cabins, living off-grid, and doing their own thing since before Manitoba was a province. There's a culture of self-sufficiency that predates modern regulatory frameworks, and the provincial government has largely accepted that trying to enforce every building code and zoning regulation in these areas would require resources they don't have and political will that doesn't exist. The building code technically applies through Manitoba's building code regulation, but permits are often not required for small structures and enforcement is complaint-driven. Translation: if your neighbors don't care and they won't because they're doing the same thing, nobody's checking whether your cabin meets setback requirements or has engineered drawings. Land prices are absurdly cheap. Properties with lake access sell for $20,000 to $60,000 for multiple acres. Raw land goes for $2,000 to $5,000 per acre. You can buy a 20-acre parcel with waterfront for what Toronto residents pay for a month's rent on a one-bedroom apartment with a view of another building. The economy is fishing, farming, and people who work in Winnipeg but live out here for affordability and space. Employment locally is limited, but Winnipeg is close enough for commuting if you can handle an hour or two of driving through landscape that makes you understand why Manitoba is called the middle of nowhere. Services are basic: grocery stores in small towns, nursing stations for healthcare, schools that serve wide areas. For serious medical needs, Winnipeg is the destination, about an hour to 2 hours depending on where you are and how fast you drive on gravel roads where moose are the primary traffic hazard. Winter is prairie Manitoba winter with cold that makes you respect the pioneers who settled here without central heating. Summer brings mosquitoes so aggressive they should be classified as apex predators, but it also brings lake life, fishing, and sunsets over water that remind you why people tolerate the other 10 months. Before we continue with more Canadian territories where bureaucrats forgot to show up, smash that subscribe button like you're declaring independence from HOA regulations, and drop a comment about the most remote place you've ever been in Canada. Number 7. Labrador's interior. the part Quebec still argues about. There's a massive chunk of Labrador that exists in jurisdictional weirdness between Newfoundland and Quebec, where the border was disputed for decades, and even now that it's legally settled, Quebec still prints maps showing it differently because apparently passive-aggressive cartography is a thing. This interior region of Labrador is so remote, so sparsely populated, and so administratively complicated that living there means existing in a space where government presence is measured in annual visits, not daily enforcement. The Labrador interior includes areas around Churchill Falls, the Upper Churchill region, and vast stretches of boreal forest and rock where population counts in dozens across thousands of square kilometers. According to Statistics Canada's generous estimates, some census divisions here have population densities of 0.01 people per square kilometer, which is a fancy way of saying nobody lives there. This isn't crown land you can just squat on, but private land ownership is possible and shockingly affordable. Properties list on Newfoundland and Labrador real estate sites for $15,000 to $40,000 for multi-acre parcels because nobody wants them except people seeking exactly this kind of remoteness. The land ownership comes with clear title, which means you're not trespassing or squatting, but legitimately owning property in a province that has largely given up on regulating what happens in areas this remote. Building codes technically exist through Newfoundland and Labrador's Building Accessibility Act, but enforcement in Labrador's interior is practically non-existent. The provincial government is focused on providing services to communities where people actually cluster. If you're building on your own land hours from any town, the chances of an inspector showing up are approximately zero unless you specifically request permits, which you probably won't. The question is always, could you survive there? Not is it legal? Because legality is theoretical when enforcement requires chartered planes and political will that doesn't exist for regulating someone's off-grid cabin that bothers nobody. Healthcare means nursing stations in larger communities or flying to Goose Bay or even St. John's for serious medical issues. Education means homeschooling or accepting that your kids will need to relocate for high school. Internet is satellite or nothing, though Starlink has made remote Labrador viable for digital workers in ways that weren't possible 5 years ago. The wildlife situation is intense. Black bears, caribou, wolves, and nature that reminds you constantly that you're a guest who can leave, but they live here. Winter is Labrador. Winter with cold snow. And darkness that tests whether you actually enjoy your own company or just thought you did. Summer brings black flies that make you reconsider every life choice, followed by mosquitoes that make the black flies seem polite. Number 6. Northern Saskatchewan's Provincial Forest. Saskatchewan's Northern Provincial Forest covers approximately 35 million hectares, which is larger than Germany, and contains approximately 0 permanent government offices because administering empty forest isn't cost-effective when you're a province struggling to provide services to actual towns where people live in numbers higher than some guy and his dog. This region isn't parkland with rangers patrolling, it's provincial crown land managed nominally by the Ministry of Environment from offices in Prince Albert and La Ronge, hours south by highway. The reality is that this massive area has people living in it, using it, building on it, and generally existing without much government interaction beyond renewing land leases if they're official or just being there if they're not. Saskatchewan allows crown land leases for recreational cabins through what they call the Recreational Cabin Program, charging annual fees of around $500 for leased lots. But here's where it gets interesting. Enforcement of what you build on that leased land is minimal. The province theoretically requires structures to meet building codes, but inspections in remote northern forest areas are rare to non-existent because sending inspectors costs more than the lease revenue generates. Beyond official leases, there are people who've just built cabins on crown land and lived there for years or decades. Is it legal? Not technically. Does the province care enough to do anything about it? Not unless you're causing environmental damage visible from space or someone complains, which they won't because the nearest someone is probably 40 kilometers away and also technically shouldn't be there either. The province publishes maps showing where crown land is available for lease, but vast areas remain unleased because demand is low for remote forest locations where the nearest road might be kilometers away and accessible only seasonally. Properties on the edge of road access sell privately for $10,000 to $30,000 because people inherit cabins or decide remote Saskatchewan no longer appeals and sell to the next person seeking isolation. Building code enforcement falls under Saskatchewan's Uniform Building and Accessibility Standards Act, but application in remote crown land situations is selective. Small cabins under a certain square footage often don't trigger permit requirements, and larger structures require permits only if you request them because the province isn't proactively monitoring northern forest for unauthorized construction. The lifestyle is extreme self-sufficiency. You're hauling water or using lakes and rivers with filtration. Power is solar, generator, or living without it. Heat is wood stove, which is fine because you're surrounded by trees. Food is what you bring, what you hunt, or what you fish because the nearest grocery store is probably L'Orange, hours away by seasonal road. Healthcare is nursing stations in indigenous communities if they'll serve you, or driving hours to towns with hospitals. Education means homeschooling or accepting that this lifestyle isn't compatible with traditional schooling. Internet is Starlink if you can afford the equipment and monthly fee. Otherwise, you're genuinely off-grid in ways that mean no emails, no streaming, no constant connectivity to a world you're trying to escape anyway. One person who lived seasonally in northern Saskatchewan forest described it as the last place in Canada where nobody asks what you're doing because nobody's there to ask. The freedom is absolute. The isolation is equally absolute. The trade-off is simple. You get space, silence, and autonomy in exchange for accepting that survival is your problem, and government services are theoretical concepts that happen to other people in other places. Number 5. Alert, Nunavut, the northernmost permanently inhabited place where permanent is relative. Alert sits on Ellesmere Island at 82 degrees north latitude, about 817 kilometers from the North Pole, and exists as a Canadian Forces station and weather monitoring facility where permanent means rotating military personnel and scientists who stay 6 months before evacuating to somewhere with sunlight and sanity. The population fluctuates between 50 and 70 people depending on season and military operations, making it the northernmost permanently inhabited place on Earth, which is impressive until you realize permanent is doing heavy lifting in that description. Alert isn't a town or municipality, it's a military installation under national defense control, which means it exists outside normal Canadian governance structures. There's no municipal government, no mayor, no property taxes, and no civilian population beyond the occasional researcher who arrives via military flight because there's no other way to get there. Could you move to Alert? Absolutely not through legal channels because it's a military base where civilians aren't permitted without authorization from national defense, which they won't give unless you're a scientist with legitimate research requiring the most northern location on Earth or a contractor working on base facilities. But the question reveals something about Canadian territory. There are places that are definitely Canada, definitely inhabited, but definitely not accessible to ordinary Canadians who technically own them through citizenship. The base exists for Arctic sovereignty, Canada maintaining presence in the high Arctic to support territorial claims against potential challenges from Russia or other nations with Arctic interests. It costs millions annually to maintain, requires constant resupply flights, and serves primarily to say, "We're here," to anyone questioning Canadian sovereignty over the Arctic archipelago. Life at Alert is confined to base buildings connected by rope systems, because visibility can drop to zero in blowing snow, and people have died from exposure walking between structures 50 meters apart. The temperature averages -32°C annually, with winter darkness lasting months and summer sun creating endless daylight that destroys sleep schedules and mental health in ways darkness never could. Number 4. The disputed Hans Island, where Canada and Denmark had a war involving whiskey. Hans Island sits between Ellesmere Island and Greenland in the Nares Strait, measuring 1.3 square kilometers of barren rock that became subject of the world's most polite territorial dispute when Canada and Denmark couldn't agree whose Arctic territory it belonged to. For decades, both countries periodically visited the island, planted flags, left bottles of whiskey or schnapps for the other country's military, and basically conducted international relations through passive-aggressive gift-giving and flag replacement. The dispute was settled in 2022 with an agreement splitting the island between Canada and Denmark, creating an actual land border between the two countries and ending history's friendliest territorial conflict. But for years before that, Hans Island existed in limbo where both countries claimed it, and neither enforced anything because it's a frozen rock with zero resources, zero population, and zero strategic value beyond pride and legal precedent. During the dispute years, Hans Island was technically Canadian according to Canada and Danish according to Denmark, which meant it existed in superposition like Schrödinger's territory, simultaneously both until someone measured it with GPS and legal documentation. People joked about moving there to escape both countries' governance, living in the only place where you could argue you were simultaneously in two countries and neither could prove otherwise. The population was always zero permanent, with occasional military personnel from Canada or Denmark visiting to perform sovereignty rituals involving flags and alcohol. No one could legally live there because both countries prohibited it, but enforcement was theoretical because getting there required icebreakers or planes, and neither country was wasting resources monitoring an uninhabited rock for squatters who would die from exposure anyway. Now that it's officially split, Hans Island represents something unique, Canada's only land border besides the United States. The eastern half is Greenland, Denmark. The western half is Nunavut, Canada. With a border running through the middle of an island so small and useless that the agreement took decades because neither country cared enough to prioritize it. Number 3, the Arctic waters of the Northwest Passage, where Canada says it's internal waters and everyone else laughs. The Northwest Passage isn't technically land, but it's Canadian territory according to Canada, and international waters according to basically every other country with boats and opinions about maritime law. This creates a unique situation where Canada claims sovereignty over Arctic waters that other nations routinely sail through while politely disagreeing about whose permission they need, which is to say nobody's according to them. Canada's position is that the waters of the Arctic archipelago constitute internal Canadian waters, making the Northwest Passage Canadian territory requiring permission to transit. The United States and European Union position is that these are international straits subject to freedom of navigation, making them international waters where Canada's permission is nice but unnecessary. This dispute matters for living free because it reveals how territorial claims work in practice. Canada says this is ours, maintains nominal presence through Coast Guard patrols and occasional military exercises, and hopes everyone agrees through passive acceptance. Other countries politely nod, sail through anyway, and basically treat Canadian sovereignty as a nice theory that shouldn't interfere with maritime commerce. For people seeking freedom, the Northwest Passage represents something interesting. Water that's definitely in Canada's geographic territory, but whose legal status depends on who you ask. Could you sail through and claim you're in international waters outside Canadian jurisdiction? The US Navy does it regularly. European research vessels do it. Commercial shipping companies are starting to do it as ice melts and the passage becomes viable for trade. The population of the Northwest Passage is zero permanent, with occasional Inuit communities on islands along the route and transient populations on ships transiting the route. There's no government beyond Coast Guard vessels that occasionally patrol and Canadian Forces operations that demonstrate sovereignty through presence. Building something on an island along the Northwest Passage requires navigating land claims, agreements with Inuit groups, federal territorial jurisdiction through Nunavut, and various environmental regulations. But the water itself exists in legal limbo, where Canada's authority is claimed but contested, making it a perfect example of how sovereignty works in remote areas. You claim it, you show up occasionally, and you hope nobody challenges you hard enough to require actually defending your position with something more substantial than maps and historical precedent. The following one is more interesting. Number 2, Northern Quebec's Nunavik region, where provincial and federal jurisdiction fight over who's responsible. Nunavik covers approximately 500,000 square kilometers of northern Quebec, about 1/3 of the province's total area, with a population of around 13,000 people spread across 14 communities. What makes Nunavik interesting for freedom seekers is that it exists in complicated jurisdictional space between Quebec provincial authority and federal responsibility for Indigenous peoples, creating gaps where governance becomes negotiable. Under the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement signed in 1975, Nunavik has special administrative status where local government operates through the Kativik Regional Government, which exercises powers normally held by municipalities but operates under provincial legislation with federal funding for Indigenous services. The result is governance that's fractured between provincial, federal, and regional authorities who sometimes disagree about who's responsible for what. Building codes theoretically apply through Quebec's construction code, but enforcement in remote Nunavik communities is limited by distance, resources, and jurisdictional complexity. The Kativik regional government has authority over some aspects of construction and land use, while the provincial government maintains ultimate jurisdiction. It rarely exercises in areas so remote that sending inspectors costs more than the regulatory compliance generates in fees. Land ownership in Nunavik is complicated by the Land Claims Agreement, creating 3 categories: Category 1 lands, Inuit community lands. Category 2 lands, Inuit hunting and harvesting rights with government jurisdiction. And Category 3 lands, provincial public lands with Inuit harvesting rights. Non-Inuit moving to Nunavik need to navigate these categories, which generally means you can't buy land outright, but might negotiate leases or rights through regional authorities if you provide value to communities through employment or services. The cost of living in Nunavik is extreme because everything's flown or shipped in during brief summer sea lift. Milk costs $12, bread costs $8, and fresh vegetables cost whatever the market will bear, which is a lot. But there's no property tax in traditional sense, no municipal fees, and if you're providing your own housing and food through subsistence activities, the monetary economy becomes optional, employment is limited to government services, mining when operations are active, and subsistence activities. Many residents combine wage work with traditional hunting and fishing, creating hybrid economies where cash income supplements land-based food procurement. For outsiders, opportunities exist mainly in healthcare, education, or skilled trades, with housing provided as part of employment because market housing doesn't exist. One person who worked in Nunavik described it as living in Canada, but a version of Canada that operates by different rules because southern rules don't make sense here, and everyone knows it, including the government. The communities are tight-knit, the landscape is stunning and harsh, and the freedom comes from necessity. You can't regulate people the same way when the nearest government office is a plane ride away and might not come for months. Number 1. The entire territory of Nunavut, where federal law applies, but federal presence doesn't. Nunavut is Canada's largest territory, covering 2.1 million square kilometers, roughly 20% of Canada's total land area, with a population of about 40,000 people. That's a population density of 0.02 people per square kilometer, which is a statistical way of saying nobody lives there across vast distances that make enforcement of federal regulations impractical to impossible. Created in 1999 through the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement, the territory exists in unique constitutional space where federal law applies, but federal capacity to administer that law is constrained by geography, climate, and the simple reality that you can't regulate what you can't reach. The territorial government is based in Iqaluit, but 25 communities spread across an area the size of Western Europe means governance is more theoretical than actual in remote regions. Building codes exist through Nunavut's adoption of the National Building Code, but enforcement varies wildly by community and is essentially non-existent in areas between communities where people maintain camps, cabins, and seasonal dwellings. The territorial government lacks resources to monitor or enforce codes across distances that make European countries look like neighborhoods. Could you move to Nunavut and live freely? Yes, with massive caveats. You'd need to navigate land ownership through the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement, which divides land between Inuit-owned parcels and Crown land. You'd need income because while living costs can be minimized through subsistence, you still need fuel, equipment, and emergency funds for situations where money is the only solution. Communities range from Iqaluit with 8,500 people and actual infrastructure to places like Grise Fjord with 130 people where the government exists as a small office, a school, and hope. Between communities exists vast emptiness where people maintain camps, hunt, fish, and live in ways that predate Canadian Confederation and continue despite it. The cost of living is catastrophic for imported goods, $15 for orange juice, $30 for chicken, $8 for milk, but can be minimized through hunting, fishing, and accepting that your diet will reflect what's available rather than what you want. Housing in communities is expensive and scarce, with waiting lists and prices that rival southern cities despite being in places where most buildings are prefab structures designed for extreme cold. But outside communities on the land, freedom exists in ways southern Canada forgot. You can build camps, live seasonally or year-round, and exist without constant government interaction because the government can't be everywhere and knows it. The RCMP have detachments in communities but can't patrol thousands of kilometers of tundra for building code violations or unauthorized dwellings. The trade-offs are extreme. Winter is 4 to 6 months of darkness with temperatures hitting -50. Summer brings 24-hour daylight, mosquitoes that make chemical warfare seem justified, and brief windows for resupply before winter returns. Healthcare means nursing stations in communities and medevac flights to southern hospitals for serious issues, which costs tens of thousands of dollars if you're not a resident with coverage. But Nunavut represents the final frontier of Canadian freedom, vast territory where federal law applies in theory, but enforcement requires presence, and presence across 2.1 million square kilometers of Arctic landscape is impossible. You can live on the land, build what you need, and exist in spaces where asking permission isn't required because there's nobody to ask and nobody checking whether you asked. One long-term Nunavut resident described it as the only place in Canada where you can still live like Canadians used to before government decided to regulate everything, not because the laws don't exist, but because the land is bigger than the government's ability to enforce them. So there you have it, 10 Canadian territories, regions, and legal gray zones where freedom still exists, not through permission but through remoteness, jurisdictional complexity, and the simple reality that Canada claimed more land than it can actually administer. These aren't easy places. They're not comfortable. They require skills most Canadians don't have, and tolerance for isolation most humans can't handle. But they're real, they're Canadian, and they prove that even in 2025, with satellites and surveillance and governments that track everything, there are still corners of this country where you can exist outside the system, not by breaking laws, but by being somewhere laws can't practically reach. Your country, your choice, your freedom. These places are waiting if you're brave enough, skilled enough, or desperate enough to actually use them. Hit that subscribe button if you learned something that makes you question what you thought you knew about Canada, and drop a comment about which of these territories sounds least terrible to you, because I want to know if anyone's actually crazy enough to try this, or if we're all just living vicariously through the idea of escape.